video, we're going to take a closer look at the determinants of demand. In particular, so we can make a distinction between a determinant that shifts the demand curve and a determinant that just moves quantity along the demand curve. And after we do that, we're going to take a look at some specific examples of determinant changes for a specific product in a single market. So let's review the determinants of demand. The first one I'm going to write up here is price. This refers to the price of whichever product we're studying the demand for. Remember, the law of demand tells us prices and quantities move in different directions. The second determinant I want to mention is what we call preferences or tastes. This is just a measure of how enthusiastic or how much you want to consume the product, or perhaps how much you don't want to consume the product and wish to avoid it. A third determinant is income. For most products, an increase in income will prompt an increase in demand. As your income rises, you can afford more of all goods. Most goods, you'll want to buy more. And in fact, we call those goods normal goods, goods for which your demand rises when your income rises and your demand falls when your income falls. There is a category of goods that we call inferior goods, and these are goods for which that relationship is flipped around. There are some products that you consume less of as your income rises and more of as your income falls. And there's more examples of this in the book, and we'll be discussing this in class. A fourth category is prices of related goods. These are goods that we classify into two categories. Substitutes, which are goods that you can consume instead of each other, and complements. And these are goods that you would consume along with each other. A fifth determinant of demand is expectations. This might involve expectations about potential future price movements. If you expected a price to rise, you might stock up on the item today. If you expected the price to fall, you might wait before buying it, and that would cause a change in your demand. Expectations might also involve other factors than price. Maybe you're hoping that consuming this product will make you healthier, or you might be wary of consuming it if you think it's going to make you feel bad. And then the last category I'm going to mention here is the number of buyers. Remember, demand captures the consumption or consumer side of the market. Consumers and buyers, those terms refer to the same thing. So as the number of buyers expands, we can think about as the market growing, there's more people willing to buy a product at any given price. That would increase the demand. And as the number of buyers decreases, we'd expect a decrease in demand. Now, before I move on to these specific examples, I just wanted to make a distinction between the types of determinants. In particular, I'm going to draw a little dashed line up here. Why? Because the price of the good is a little bit different, or is a special determinant of demand. It's distinct from these other categories. And I'm just going to note here, a change in price leads to a change in quantity demanded. That means that we simply move along the demand curve. Now that's very different from how we see the effects of these other determinants. I'm going to try and squeeze in right down here at the bottom a sample demand curve. I'm going to put Q on my horizontal axis, P on the vertical axis, Q for quantity, P for price. And here's a basic demand curve. If I change the price, what I can do is I can just move or slide along the demand curve to the new corresponding quantity. I don't need to draw a new curve. For any of these other determinants, determinants, and we'll try and draw a little bracket here. A change in any one of these would lead to what we call a change in demand. The entire demand curve will shift. The relationship between price and quantity is different than it was before. I'm just going to draw an arrow here. Entire curve shifts. So it might seem like semantics, but the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded is very important for you to keep straight in your mind. Okay, now let's move on to thinking about the demand for milkshakes at Shake Shack. That's a particular establishment that sells, obviously, milkshakes and some other products. And we're going to look at 3 specific examples of what might happen to the demand for milkshakes if a determinant changes. So we're going to identify which determinant is changing, we're going to see the consequences, and we're going to draw a picture to keep track of what's happening. So the first thing I want to mention is I've got my axes set up here, but I'm going to label them as I did there. We put price on the vertical axis, denoted with a P, and quantity on the horizontal axis, denoted with a Q. And I'm just going to draw in a starting demand curve, which I'll label D1. Now our first change here, Shake Shack raises its price for a milkshake. Let's think about what's going on, and in particular, let's see which one of these determinants we could classify this under. Here what we're seeing change is a change in the price of a milkshake. That corresponds to the first determinant on our list. So what does that mean? Well, let's just say Shake Shack's starting price was here, P1. That corresponds to quantity Q1, quantity demanded. If Shake Shack raises its price for a milkshake to P2, everything we need to know to forecast or predict the change in the market, change in the demand side of the market, is right here on the graph. I have an existing demand curve. I don't need to draw a new demand curve. I've already got price here on my axis, and so I can just see what quantity corresponds to that new price. And in fact, what we see is that price increases, quantity demanded decreases, and this just confirms for us the law of demand. And I'm just going to summarize that this is what we call a change in quantity demanded. Sometimes we might refer to this as a movement along a demand curve. And I'll just draw some arrows to represent that. Okay, that's our first example. My second example, Ben & Jerry's, an alternative ice cream establishment, raises its price for a milkshake. So as we did before, I'm going to label my axes and draw an initial demand curve, which I'll call D1. Now we don't know anything about the specific price of milkshakes at Shake Shack, and we don't need to in this type of analysis. All we really need to do here is identify what type of determinant of demand is changing. Now it's a price, but it's not the price of milkshakes at Shake Shack, it's the price for a milkshake at Ben & Jerry's. And that, as I said, it's an alternative place to buy something like a milkshake. That means it's a substitute. So here we see change in the price of a substitute. Now, logically, if I can go to one or two places to buy a milkshake, and one of those places raises its price, it's going to make me more likely to go to the other location. So this should be good news for Shake Shack, because this change in the price, in particular an increase in the price of a substitute, should increase the demand for milkshakes at Shake Shack. So we'll say increase increased demand for Shake Shack milkshakes. And this is what we refer to as a change in demand, and specifically an increase in demand. And I need to draw a new curve for this example. Increase in demand. And if I'm increasing my demand, what it's saying is regardless of what price Shake Shack is charging for a milkshake, it should expect to see more customers regardless of the price. That is a rightward shift of the demand curve, and again, that's an increase in demand. Okay, our final example, lactose is the new gluten. For a while, people have been very conscious of their gluten consumption. There's been a rising awareness of celiac disease, but also a number of people avoiding gluten, even if they aren't suffering from that condition. Let's say lactose becomes the new focus of people's nutrition. Many people might choose to avoid dairy products. Lactose is a milk sugar found in dairy products. So let's think about how this might alter the demand for milkshakes at Shake Shack. Well, a milkshake is made with milk, a dairy product. So what we'd expect is people wanting to consume less. Now we could classify this as a decrease in preferences, or we can also think about it as a drop in the number of buyers. Either way, logically it seems that we'd expect fewer purchases of milkshakes at every price. So once again, let me draw my starting diagram. Price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. My initial demand curve for milkshakes at Shake Shack, D1. Now, I have a decrease in preferences or a drop in the number of buyers interested in milkshakes. And again, we don't need to know what the specific price of a milkshake is at Shake Shack. All we need to know is which determinant is changing and in which direction. Here, what we'd expect is a decrease or a leftward shift in my demand curve. So we'd expect this to decrease the demand for Shake Shack milkshakes. And as in the example above, because we're not changing the price, but we're focusing on a different determinant, then that would translate into what we call a change in demand. And that's going to lead us to draw a new demand curve. Now, there's lots of other examples we might think of. You might want to test yourself on what you expect to happen if people's income goes up or down, if the weather changes, or even if Shake Shack gets some bad publicity, as happened earlier this spring in the United States. Shake Shack was a recipient of a grant supposedly for targeted at small businesses. Shake Shack is a large corporation, but it has a lot of individual franchises, and it didn't get some favorable reporting in the press about accepting that initial payment from the federal government. That might decrease people's preference or appetite for a Shake Shack milkshake. So I encourage you to think about some other determinants and work through, and again, the key point here, making sure you recognize the difference between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand.